Welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. A very good day to you. This is Life Matters, and thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Heritage Day. And not just more of an heritage, it's so much more of history and culture and, facts from around the world that we've come into South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, that we need to understand. But specifically, we'll be delving into the Muslim heritage here in Southern Africa. And I have online with me Professor Mohammed Faadiel Arnold, the rector for HLL University Holistic Leisure Learning. He's an artist and author, and as well as a conductor for holistic methodologist, as understanding the holistic problem solving idea, and publisher as well. And now I would add to that an historian, because there's so much more that we can learn and have learned from his beautiful series that he has available on YouTube. Let me just get to that quickly. It's called The Real Cape Muslim History. So welcome back, Professor Arnold. Awesome chatting to you about this topic and understanding that you have also published a book relating to Muslims not being descendants from slaves. And let us quickly understand some of the findings and the books that you were able to use to base those findings on.
Yes. So the core findings were that, and it's all the other books, is that they stated that the Muslims who were arriving in 1658, nobody must disturb their faith. They have the freedom to be Muslims. And if they want to become Christians, they must not stand in their way. Now, that's a very important point there, which tells you they were not Christians that arrived, but the Muslims that arrived. Mm. And so the freedom that the Dutch allowed the Muslims to be, because they needed the tailors, they needed the dressmakers, they needed the builders, they needed the defenders, the soldiers, and they needed people that they can trust. So Van Riebeeck applied for that. When the Dutch took over, as because they already had a track record of very honest and hardworking people, and also people that are uprighters. So when Van Riebeeck then requested those people to come here, it was because of a history of knowing these people are dependable people that they can depend on to assist him to protect the colony from being taken over by other, European countries, and also to help them build this particular the houses, etc., that they needed, and do the foods that they need, etc. So there is a very clear history that slaves did not have their own surnames. They were stripped of their own identities, and the coffee trade is mostly Mozambican slaves that were brought into the Cape.
Okay.
How do we know that? Is because when Lord Caledon, as they call him, he stated that the Mozambican slaves are becoming Muslim, and therefore we need to start our own Christian schools. And that's how, because the madrasas at the time, during the Dutch, were proliferated in the World Cup. There was like 80 madrasas, home madrasas. There was, at that time, while the Dutch was there, so that already points out to you that these people were free to, because no slaves could be educated by law. The slave masters were not allowed to teach them anything. Their children they couldn't get married. And yet the Muslims from the beginning, from 1658 onwards, they married, they had their own ceremonies, etc. Another very interesting thing is the amount of ratib, swords, and the benches that were in Cape Town that were brought in. And the ratib jama'as that existed, and the zikr jama'as, it shows that these people could not have been slaves because they had swords. Okay. And then they had this language, which I today call Boerkaps, because it's particularly a Boerkap language. It's a mix of about 17 odd languages, bring together, and then the Arabic, which had an influence on the sound structure. Now, some people call it Afrikaans Arab, but it's not so, because Afrikaans is a more oppressive language that later developed afterwards. But so it's not really Afrikaans. We can perhaps call it like. And they say Arabic Afrikaans, but it wasn't Arabic. It's just the letters of Arabic, but the sound structure of the Arabic influenced the way we speak.
But
And
was that when they used? Because I know at the time of apartheid, they used to use certain languages. They used to use that Arabic written language because we understood and could read the Quran in Arabic. They wrote it in Arabic, but they read it in the language of Afrikaans.
that was long before apartheid.
Okay.
The Muslim leaders wrote in Arabic script for the people that were here,
Okay.
because the people couldn't read, but they were taught how to recite Quran. Now that history of the mushafs, as they call it, they call
Yes.
it these Arabic script books, is there's an enormous amount, and that also proves the fact that there was no kind of hidden agenda in order to teach the deed. The deed was taught publicly. But it was not propagated publicly, but people came to learn the deen in all the houses in madrasa. So the Dutch had that kind of connection with the Muslims, and they also married into the Muslims. And so one of the things that is interesting, which people didn't pick up, which I picked up in, was the fact that the owner of the Owa Masjid, the lady was actually a Dutch woman and became Muslim.
Yeah.
So
Sarki van de Kaap?
Sarika is the daughter of that lady who is actually Muslim, and they were white people, white, and how do you know that they were white? It's because Imam Hassan, who is the dialect related from Sarki van de Kaap, and all his children are white with blue eyes.
So how could she have been a slave?
You can't argue with genetics. You can argue with the reference, but you can't argue with genetics. So the whole Hassan family are all white with blue eyes. And so that tells you that there was a distinct connection between the Dutch and the Muslims, to the point, and there were obviously political prisoners here, like Tuan Guru and others, like Yusuf and so on. But that shows you that they were very scared of Muslims. That's why they had to send them to the farthest point of the known world, because they didn't want the Muslims to come in uprise in Indonesia, because as they stated up till today, Muslims fight to die to go to China, and everybody else fights to live. So you can't beat people like that. So they didn't want the Muslims to come into uprise in those particular areas. And so they sent them here.
Yeah.
And they didn't want the Muslims here to come into uprise. So they gave them the freedom to believe, the freedom to practice their faith. That makes absolutely sense. And the other thing which is interesting in the records of history is when Sheikh Yusuf arrived, Simon van Sastel went out to welcome him with the official welcoming.
Yeah. So which means that he wasn't the first Muslim to arrive here then?
No, he was like, for instance, he was feared already and given the honor to be, and then secondly, his followers came with him. Now, who's going to come with your Sheikh if there's slavery here?
And
it doesn't make sense with your family.
So it's amazing how you put all of this together, and for us to reconcile now what we have learned and what we were talking about all the time. But let's talk about Sheikh Yusuf and some of those that were claimed to be political prisoners. And we understand that they were that they were royalty. Some of the names that come to mind as the Effendis, I'm not sure if that would fall under that context. But those that had come from many cultures and many countries, and that is why we are so diversely intertwined in our DNA, alhamdulillah.
The reason why they came to the Cape is because it was the only place that they could freely, without the pressure of education, that they could come here in the Cape and actually be free Muslims, because in the other parts of the world, they were more kind of trying to control the masses through education and through lifestyles, etc. of the Dutch, the British. The Dutch didn't bother much, but the British did. Now, how do we know that the Muslims couldn't have been slaves? Because the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire had an agreement of protecting each other's citizens within their particular empire. Now, that is a very important point, because when the British took over the first occupation of the Dutch, which is in 1794, that was the year they came in here and they had to actually release Tuan Guru from the prison. Because under the treaty between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, they have to protect the Muslims. So there you had the Dutch protecting the Muslims because the Muslims helped them. Now you have the British protecting the Muslims because of the Ottoman Empire. So that it shows you exactly that these particular, the Muslims per se had the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time.
Yes.
And so all the leaders on the shuyukh would come into Cape Town to propagate and to, not to propagate, but to teach Islam because they had this freedom of growth.
Yeah.
And so our books are so varied, and our people that came to settle here with their families are varied. Now, no people are going to come here and settle here if they know they're going to be taken as slaves. So it
I
just
think,
doesn't make sense.
yeah, I think all of this is now somewhat of a deeper understanding that why we have such, alhamdulillah, in the
A
Cape,
beautiful
such
history.
a rich and deep history. Understanding that, you know, we weren't really their slaves. And when you look at the psychology around that, because if you come to an area where you are condemned and there's negative connotation, it does put you in a different light, but yet our spirits
Yeah.
was never broken. We need to
So
take a quick
that
break. We need to take a quick break, Dr.
yeah.
Arnold. This conversation,
Okay.
you know, I know it's, you know,
Now
can
you
go
touched
on
on
for
a good
hours.
point, which I'd like to carry on after the break.
Okay, so we'll touch on that when we come back
Yeah,
shortly with Professor Mohamed Faadiel Arnold, broadcasting live here, Life Matters, and he joins us from the Western Cape in Boerkaap, Cape Town, more just after this. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very good day to you, good evening wherever you are. Remember, you can live stream us as well. So no matter if you're over the beautiful oceans and across the mountains, you can do so on www.hilaal.tv. I'm Hoa Solomon. Stay with me for the next hour as we talk on this beautiful Heritage Day, heritage, the descendants and our culture, and where we come from, specifically the Muslim culture and the Muslim descendants here in South Africa, starting at its base in Cape Town. And we have none other than someone that carries many, many hats, Professor Mohamed Faadiel Arnold, who is the rector for HLL, Holistic Leisure Learning University. He, of course, specializes in holistic methodology, and he has many skills to fit that hat, an artist being one of it, an author, conducts holistic problem solving, publisher, theater production, and so much more. But we'll hear all about that. And about a year ago, he started a YouTube channel which spoke about the descendants, the real Cape Muslim history part in different parts, alhamdulillah. But let's introduce this gentleman. He wants to be better known as Maardekers, the descendants of Maardekers. So welcome, Professor Mohamed Faadiel Arnold, to Life Matters. It's an absolute...
for asking me to come on. Again, I hope I will be able to help wherever it's possible, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It's always a pleasure chatting to you, and this one in a different realm, and we appreciate your time. You're filling so many hats, alhamdulillah, and it's so awesome to know that you love the rich history of Cape Town and the Muslims in South Africa as well. You, of course, specialize in holistic leisure learning, but because of your research, I found it fit for you to talk to us on this day, this Heritage Day, about the heritage of South Africa and the Muslim descendants. So just quickly explain, you wanted to be introduced as the descendants of Maardekers. Give us a little bit of explanation about that quickly.
The Maardekers, you asked me to define it. So,
yes, please.
But it's interesting because there is a narrative that colonialists started, and they basically created this kind of image that Boerkaap and the Cape Muslims are descendants of slaves. And but the narratives don't seem to fit. Even some of the tour guides, etc., and also like people who do research in Cape Muslims, they can't seem to put the points together. And alhamdulillah, I had the opportunity to do the research and then wrote the book on the Boerkaap and Cape Muslims are not descendants of slaves, but they are actually the emancipators of slaves, which was quite a mouthful because it changed the whole narrative. The interesting part of it is I actually found the evidence in the same books which claim that we were descendants of slaves. So that was interesting.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because, I mean, some of us are descendants of royalty, I believe, and some of us are descendants of teachers that have been brought to the Cape, and then some also possibly slaves. So how does that all mix together?
one of the features that is interesting is that the history of Jan van Riebeeck is always presented as if he was like a colonial, like a settler, you know. But he was actually on a 10-year sentence for using the company's name for his own personal gain.
Okay.
So he was actually a criminal. They had a choice of either be jailed in Netherlands or come and create a halfway station at the Cape with about 80 people, 80 men, to try and organize for the ships that are passing the Cape to go to the east. So that kind of history is not told because they keep a kind of a positive history about Jan van Riebeeck, but that's the reality. And so that, and then the writers in Cape history will use the words, even in the research, possibly, maybe there were Muslim slaves with it, you know. So having used the word possibly, maybe, could have been, is not factual, but it has been said so often that people tend to believe. So, but what was interesting is that Jan van Riebeeck, as he came here, obviously they put up tents here to start the building of the castle and starting the farm, you know, which is here in Boka, basically.
Okay.
But the storms, they didn't know about the storms. So the storms actually destroyed many of their tents, and something like 19 of them were killed. So in all the books is written that Van Riebeeck then wrote to the Dutch government asking them to send the Marduikers and the Amboyans to come and assist and defend them. Because at the same time, that was in 1657, he made the application. Because at the same time, the Italians and other European countries were aiming to actually take over the Cape. So he needed some people to defend him. And the Dutch knew the Marduikers from Indonesia. In the sense that when the Portuguese came to Indonesia, they settled as traders in Indonesia. And the Marduikers, the Portuguese explains the Marduikers as people of the earth that remember God, and they have like a light, illuminating light and a strength which they identified about these people. And so the Portuguese actually asked them to protect them like a security, so that people don't steal from them, etc., as traders. And that particular period between the Portuguese and the Indonesians, they started marrying, our beautiful women in Indonesia, etc. And so they were later called the Euro-Asians because they were a mix of white and colored and, and brown and all of those kind of people. But they had this particular presence, which was one of the Portuguese historians write about the Marduikers, they have a sense of presence which made people respect him.
Let's talk about the idea of us being descendants as slaves. You said possibly, can be, maybe. Where does that idea come from?
What the evidence of that is that in 1657, the placard of the demon placard was promulgated in the Cape by the Dutch, stating that the Amboyans are coming in 1658. They will be coming, and they have the freedom to be Muslims. Nobody must disturb their faith, and they are free to practice their faith, but not to propagate their faith. And that Van Diemen placard is in all the books, basically. That was used in India before, in the East before, to protect the Muslims, the faith of the Muslims. So that was done a year before the Marduikers arrived, before the Amboyans arrived, who were basically the people who were supposed to, who must assist Van Riebeeck to create the settlement here. The builders, the people who are, the soldiers, or the people who must defend them. And therefore they had this kind of protection for Muslims who arrive. And that was a choice for them to come, and they came with their families because it was a free kind of opportunity to come and practice and live and even get land in order to do the farming, etc. And that's one of the reasons why Bokap is very much property owned by Muslims in families. So if you look at the rules of slavery, and if you look at the records of slavery, you'll find that the slaves' identity were removed from them. They were just, the slave master was there, and then all the numbers of slaves that they have underneath it. So the slaves were removed, their identity was removed, their faith was removed. They have to follow exactly what the masters do. But there were other rules which makes us realize that the Muslims of the Cape couldn't have been the descendants of slaves.
Okay.
And that is the fact that they had their own surnames.
I want to touch on that idea of the surnames as well, because often when families do delve into the history and going back to, using their surnames, they come to a complete stop and lost, in fact, because that was not possibly the real surnames. How can one, and we have to take a quick break as well, but how can one, do that history research of your family and going back to where you really come from if you don't even have your proper surname?
Well, the interesting thing is the Muslims kept their own surnames, always had their own surnames, and it was easy for these people who do this family, family tracks. But what the point that I am presenting from the research is the fact that these Muslims that came to settle here were free to assist and to defend and to own land and to work with the land to assist the colony, because the Van Riebeeck people were very small, so they needed assistance. So that the Mardeka's history was very much taken out or marginalized because the colonists didn't want to know people and want to let the people know that the Muslims defended them and protected them. And neither did some of the Muslims want to know that they protected the colonialists, but not in the sense of protecting them for oppression. That was not the case. But protecting anybody who has property, anybody from any particular crime, that's a Muslim, that's his duty. And the Muslims that arrived here were saying to them, if you continuously grant us, if you do not disturb our faith, we'll assist you because you are protecting our faith. If one wants to know that, where is the evidence of that? The bottom Kapini Street Masjid, it's actually called the Queen Victoria Masjid because some of the Muslim men went to defend the coastline. In return, they said, we'll do that if you give us extra land for a masjid. So that was a common kind of communication was, we'll do this for you if you
bargaining and bartering
to go against our faith. But they were very scared to go against the Muslims' faith.
So
how do we know?
Yeah, I want to. Sorry, Professor Arnold. Sorry. I want to take a quick break, and there's so much more that I want to ask, but just those few points that you've mentioned now, and the rich heritage of the Cape Muslims and the real Muslim history that you've conducted on YouTube, a program, a series of talks as well. I want to get into that, and of course your book. That Muslims weren't really slaves, descendants rather of slaves. We'll talk more with Professor Mohammed Faadiel Arnold just after this. Stay with us.
Sure.
Welcome back. I'm Hawa Solomon. Stay with me for another 2 segments as we dig into the heritage on this beautiful Heritage Day. And I hope that you are celebrating your heritage in every way. Online, I have Professor Mohammed Faadiel Arnold joining us from the Boerkaap in Cape Town. And we definitely taking a deep dive into the Muslim heritage of Cape Town, of the Western Cape, and understand that we weren't really descendants of slaves. So before the break, Professor Arnold, I mentioned some interesting facts which you wanted to comment on.
The fact that because they couldn't beat the Muslims physically, and they couldn't beat them in actual fact intellectually because they were highly educated in terms of their own language, Arabic, etc., and the Quran and so on. the later generations, the only thing that they could do was to create a kind of a psychological game
Yeah.
to make us believe that we were slaves so that we can lose our self-esteem. And they were successful in many ways. People like, some
They
of
were.
the people that I tell them, look, you weren't descendants of slaves, but because they are involved in the kind of business, they don't want to accept it because I'm getting funded because of this. So it's a kind of a history that speaks to you in the sense of we had our own language.
Yeah.
And therefore, they couldn't penetrate our culture because we spoke differently, we wrote differently, and we didn't read their particular texts. We couldn't read the Dutch and the English, etc., only few. So there also what was done by the colonialists was to actually write letters and documentation claiming it was our leaders who wrote that they submit to them and they were in jail, etc., and they got nobody else to depend on, only them to free them and things like that as political. But it's just impossible that people that fought them for the sake of the deen and were prepared to die would make statements like that and in perfect English. It's like, what? This is not possible. So they will not concocted particular features inside because if they couldn't beat us physically, they aim to beat us psychologically.
Yeah.
And that narrative is very powerful. So when you bring up a narrative like this or the facts of the matter, then it's even difficult for our own people to accept because it makes a nice story, these slaves have become free, but you don't realize that if you were already free, why should you accept that particular narrative unless you have a political agenda, you know what I'm saying? But a factual agenda is the main feature that needs to be brought forward. But the fear of Muslims has been a tremendous feature. And one of the things is that they decided, for instance, when the British came on board, the British realized that some of the slaves became Muslim because the slave quarters, the Mozambican slave quarters in the churches became empty.
Okay.
But this was an interesting feature because some of the slave masters, they didn't want the slaves to drink wine. So they sent him to the Burqa on their free day so that they can become Muslim. But what they didn't realize is they refused by law that the slaves could not marry by Christian rights. They cannot marry, but they can have children, and the children are the property of the slave master.
Yeah.
But when the Africans, the Mozambican Africans became Muslim again, in the Burqa, they could marry.
Yes.
And we could have children, you see. And some of these particular black slaves that became Muslims went back and they would kill an unfair master as a jihad.
Sure.
And so they were very scared of Muslims to make them slaves or to try and deal with them because they are scared of the Muslims.
Okay.
Now, that came out in the history of Lady Barnard, where she actually speaks about Muslims, that people that became Muslim who actually killed their masters, who were unfair to the other slaves. Now, how do we know that the black Muslims, like the Muslims that were black that became Muslim, and the Europeans that became black, or they became Muslim, were different than the original Muslims that arrived here free and were actually?
Yeah.
It's by the language. We had a language that identified ourselves as different.
Yeah.
People that were, with all due respect, not the racist thing, but people became Muslim who were like dark complexion. They were called masbikas.
Okay. That's the first time I heard that one.
From the word Mozambican.
Oh,
and the
right.
people
Okay.
that were white that became Muslim were called Walanas from overseas.
Oorlanes. So originating from the Afrikaans word. And even the word Afrikaans, if I look at it, it means Africa, A-F-R-I, Afri, from Africa, and then Kaans, I don't know. Does that make sense in any way?
To me, it's just that, when you start standardizing a language for political reasons, then you start trying to marginalize the masses.
Yes.
So I'll give you an example. If we would say to you, if you are crazy, we'll say, as General Badone.
Yes. Where does that come from?
But we use it so beautifully that
like it's a real word.
Saying, no, this is a swear word.
Is that word also originally from the Burqa language?
It's a normal word that we use as General Badone. But
And
they
and
didn't like
and
it
I
because
was listening to someone the other day and they said, "Ik weet boggerol wat hier aangaan." You know, and it sounds like a swear word.
it's bugger all,
Buggerol,
it's bugger
yeah.
all. But the reason why we speak like that is because the Arabic is like that. It will
Okay.
use easy letters and sounds in order to make it easy to, in actual
Yes.
fact, speak.
Yes.
So the Arabic language has a tremendous impact on the way we use any language.
Okay.
Whether it's English, whether it's French, whether it's Xhosa, whether it is, Dutch, etc. We will move with that language and make it easy for us to understand. And that also made it difficult for the standardized language to, in actual fact, understand what we're saying.
Yeah.
But now, at this moment in time, the Afrikaans language as a standard language is dying, you see. So now the Afrikaners are now coming to the book up and saying, look, we need to research your language, because if they don't come and talk about our language, then our Afrikaans departments are going to die.
Let's talk
But
about
now-
the heritage quickly, Professor, about the multi-dimensional DNA that we have within us. Because
We
if I
all
could just
have
use,
about-
if I use
we all
myself
have
as an
about
example,
DNA.
my father's mother is De Jong, so she's Indonesia. She kept the surname,
Yeah.
alhamdulillah. My father's father is Solomon, which they thought, that actually originated from Suleiman, and they're from Yemen. My mom, mother's side originated from Irish, and she was a revert, and her father as well from the Netherlands was also a revert. So myself, if I look, I've got fingers in like 4 different
Okay.
continents.
Let me share you something which is part of the research. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is it freaks people out, but they don't want to know this.
Okay.
In 1790 something. Okay. Remember 1794. The masjid was actually started in 1794, with the moment the British released Nabi Tuangguru
Okay.
under the Ottoman agreement. And he started the madrasa. He had like 700 children in there.
Sure.
Okay, and there was another 80 madrasas that were operating. Now that already tells you the freedom that these people had
Yes.
to practice their faith.
Yes.
Not to publicly invite people to Islam, but to practice their faith. It was perfect. And if you look at the amount of information, the books that are written on fiqh, etc., and from the different shuyukh that settled here,
Yeah.
then you can see it's a rich history of knowledge which was not part of a slave culture. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So so there are people that became Muslim from the Dutch, from the British, from the Africans, etc. But not as much as the Indonesians and the Malaysians. Actually, we are more Indonesian related than Malaysian, because Malaysia was a massive country on its own, you see. And the colonists couldn't attack the big mainlands. They attacked the smaller islands around. And what is a very interesting thing is 50% of the slaves were Indian. And these were
Yes.
Indian
Yes.
children that they actually stole from playgrounds, etc.
Sure.
And that history is not coming forward. Are you with me? And also the fact of the matter, where's the black people that were slaves? That's coming up for. What about the Dutch that were in actual fact put into concentration camps and enslaved by the British? So how come the Buka Muslims are the only descendants of slaves? It is because after apartheid came to a fall.
Yes.
The Boer, the Afrikaner never spoke about us being descendants of slaves.
Yeah.
They knew it wasn't the truth. They knew we are integrated. They had the freedom. It is only when apartheid came to a fall, this particular, Western Cape started developing this kind of narrative that the Muslims were descendants of slaves. It's an anti-Islamic kind of attack.
Yeah.
And then also bringing in the colorful houses, which
Of
becomes
the
another
book
joke
of,
because the colorful houses only
Of the
started
slaves,
in the year 2000,
Yes.
before at the time. And now they've got the stories about we painted different colors in because we wanted to be free as slaves, and all this kind of nonsense is being spoken around. So it just doesn't make sense, because technology for color paint only came through Plascon in the year 1999 to 2000.
So it doesn't even begin to make. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
It was basically white. Most of the buildings were
Buildings,
white
yeah.
because it was chalk that they used, to paint.
I want to look at after the break with the importance of understanding this heritage and going to go and find out the answers for themselves and some of the books that are available that people can research. Professor Arnold, we'll chat to you just after this. Stay with us on this beautiful Heritage Day as we delve into the Muslim heritage of South Africa, specifically in the Cape. Back in a moment. Welcome back as we wrap up Heritage Day Life Matters show, and we celebrate our beautiful heritage in every way. I donned my bright mustard shirt today and hope in your own way that you are celebrating where you are coming from, where you come from rather, and understand that it's a mixture of so much more if you're based in South Africa. I remember my mom going on Hajj and they got to Saudi and my father was dark of complexion, my mom's light, and they couldn't understand where they were coming from, Turkey, from India, whatever, and they just mentioned South Africa and then they said, Mandela. So such a rich and diverse culture that we come from. I have online with me Professor Mogamat Faadiel, Arnold, Rector of the HLL University Holistic Leisure Learning, and alhamdulillah, I can add to that also historian. He's published many books and author, artist of note. You can even take your burqa, your T-shirt to him and he'll paint you an original burqa art for you especially. So welcome back, Dr. Arnold, Professor Arnold rather, and I want to give our viewers also some concepts about that, and we'll put up some pictures as well of some of the T-shirts that you've painted. Before we talk about the rich history and where we can find that, the true findings, and question it and make sense of it, I want to ask you about this very interesting concept that you've got going with regards to the Cape Town and the burqa and painting original artwork.
Yes, I decided to change the narrative in the sense because now in the burqa there's so much tourism in burqa and so many non-Muslims that are settling in burqa for their business. They sell photography, they've got galleries in the burqa, all trying to capture this rich heritage.
Yeah.
But they're not Muslim. They're coming in here and they do all sorts of stuff here because it is the natural state of the beauty of the spirit that is left by our forefathers, that is, and by the azan and by the masajids, that is actually attracting people. Their deep fitra, even though they don't believe it, it's still their deep fitra that's attracting them to this beautiful part of Cape Town. So I call burqa now the treasure chest of Cape Town. And I use the word original, okay? It's original, meaning it's you that's original, okay? It's an original painting. It's original in terms of burqa being such a vibrant particular community. And also how the Creator has protected the Muslims all the time, over all the years. In every particular generation and political movement, there were particular people and institutional features that protected the Muslims all the time. And if you analyze the dhikrs that the people made, which I wrote a book on Imamat, where I analyzed every single word of the dhikrs that you do, the khadat, the people when the people die, giving people name, etc. And if you look at the dhikrs that were made, you can see how Allah Ta'ala protected these people because of the dhikrs that they made. And this was actually a supply for them every week. They had dhikrs every single week. And this would be the time when they share cakes, etc. And imams would get a bigger barakat, Look what they did with the movie barakat, where they actually it's a derogatory way of presenting the Muslims. Yeah. And the actual beauty of a barakah, which became the sustainability of our people every week. This was the food for the week.
Yeah.
So there are many houses that had khadat, and many houses they shared this food, so they would have food for the week.
Yeah.
And then because of the British saying that Muslims cannot go to school beyond grade 4, Muslims in actual way said, okay, fine, then you can keep your education. We'll teach our people craftsmanship, and we'll teach them, and we'll give them jobs, and the Creator is going to give them food and sustenance. Yeah. The Muslims became a self-sustainable community, economic and self-sustainable group here in the burqa in the Cape. And many people became Muslim because the young people could be employed by the Muslim craftsmen. Up till today, the Muslim craftsmen are still dominating the building trade.
Yeah.
And some of them with no certificates whatsoever because they put their trust in Allah and Allah provided for them to the point that everybody is dependent on Muslims in the country. And we're only 2%.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it. We're only 2%.
Sure.
So when I was on flights and a Malaysian asked me, what percentage of Muslims are you in the Cape? And I said, we're only 2% of Muslims in South Africa. And he says, it can't be. You look like 90% in the media.
Alhamdulillah.
And then he was quiet. We were sitting in the haram. He was quiet for a few seconds. And he said to me, you know what? Do you know what? The malaikas are with you. The angels are with you. That is why you look so strong.
Yes,
and I said to him, oh my goodness, you know, the point
Culture
that you're
was...
making it's powerful, and we've seen how the malaikas and the awliya in actual fact has been alive and supported us.
Absolutely.
And you know, the other world, the unseen world, is something that the non-Muslims, they fear it. So the only way they can actually attack us is emotionally, educationally, psychologically, and let us trip ourselves. Let us trip ourselves in the process. And in that process, they don't have to do anything. And that's why the Quran starts with, this is a book in which there is no doubt for those who have consciousness of Allah. Because all the kafir does is to create doubt in people. Is that so? Isn't that so? Because the whole academic world is based on doubt. Are you with me? My argument is, and your argument is, you know, this is my reference and so on. And it's a game that is being played, but it's a trap. It's a trap to keep people in the same particular culture. I call academia a cult because there are only a certain way of doing things.
Yeah.
And if you do it creatively, they don't accept it. But creative work comes from Allah. That's why they don't want to accept creative work. But creative work is there, and it's always been there, and that is what creates an identity of people. Now the Muslims have a major, beautiful identity.
Yeah.
And to break that identity down is to play the game of saying, but no, you're descended of slaves, and maybe you were this, and maybe you were that. And but let me explain this, a very, very important thing.
Okay.
There is a video called a 3-hour video on YouTube called the incredible journeys of Mary Bryant.
Okay.
I went to do that because I stay off Bryant Street.
Okay.
In that video, you see that the British took the undesirable criminals in hulls of ships. And they actually were on their way to the Cape to settle them here as the first colonialists in actual fact. They were free from the British, but they were actually criminals.
Sure.
They left them here first, and it is a terrible movie in terms of what that woman went through by to save her children. But what is interesting is that they had a structure in which they put all the undesirables in the colonies to start their own particular, and they would say, if you marry now, even if you're male and female, if you marry now, then we'll give you a piece of land to start your own home. And so these people change their own names.
I think our viewers need to delve into that. Sorry, Professor.
It's like on another level.
It sounds
and they changed their names, they changed their history because they didn't want anybody to know that they were criminals.
So the video's name again?
It's called The Incredible Journey of Mary Bryant. It's a 3-hour documentary, a documentary film.
That's on YouTube.
Based on her diary, on what she has written. And it brings out the real feature of who the colonialists were. Sure. And they used to work for the British, for the Queen, in order to produce for them.
I want to look at, sorry, Prof, we've just got literally 2 minutes, under 2 minutes left. I want to quickly look at some of the findings that we can look at, that we can read, the research that we can, do for ourselves, and what's available for us to get the proper understanding. Yeah.
I've got a book called The Book Ups as the Language of Colonial Resistance.
Okay.
That's one book available. And then I've got a book up in Cape Muslims are not descendants of slaves, but the emancipators of slaves.
Okay.
And then there's the book of Dr. Ajam, Professor Ajam, that I was honored to actually edit it, which is called The Cape Muslim History of Muslim Schools, Islam-based Schools.
Okay.
That's available on YouTube, on Book Up Alpha, The Real Cape Muslim History, which I also touch on these features in that particular book, because there you can see also how the Muslims in actual fact developed themselves. So what is a very important point before we sign off is whoever governed the Cape knew that morality and decency was in actual fact the Muslims could do that and keep the people calm and keep the people, not only the Muslims, but keep everybody calm. That's why they also protected the Muslims, because the Muslims brought spirituality and brought morality to the Cape, and they wanted to keep that morality because they lost their morality.
Yeah.
Many of them lost their morality in the fight for land. But they knew that the Muslims will keep it going. And that's why today, alhamdulillah, Allah Ta'ala is still protecting us, because we are the people that open up the doors to everybody to become Muslim. So I'm very happy about many people that have become Muslim, that are settling in Cape, in the Burqa and in the Cape, and they see the truth.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful that I could actually work within that framework to try and change and bring, not change, but bring the real history forward, and then people can realize why the spirit of the Cape is so different to any other part in the world.
Absolutely.
Because we had so many shuyukh that settled here because of the freedom of place.
Well, the next project I think we can delve into is the history of the Muslims in the rest of South Africa, and how that would be, because I mean, just being here in Johannesburg and traveling to Durban, and I was in Mauritius recently. The Muslims from around the world and from where they come from within their provinces is so beautiful and cultured in the way that you want to discover more from where they do come from. But Professor Arnold, we have to wrap up. It was awesome chatting to you. Always a pleasure taking ourselves back to the real history of the Cape and understanding, how we can contextualize all of that, and let us understand that there is the information available that we can go and research and find the correct diction of what we really need to understand about the Cape Muslims. But Professor Arnold, all the strength and the barakah in your life, and the rizq, may Allah strengthen in everywhere and increase in all that you need, and grant you to be with us for a long time to come, to impart all this wonderful and real rich information that we need in our society, inshallah.
Shukran to you. May Allah grant you also and your family all the best, inshallah, and all the people that are doing the good work to spread the truth, inshallah. May Allah accept it from us, inshallah.
Ameen. Jazakallah. Jazakallah. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Salams to your family and everybody out in the west, in the Cape Burqa area. That was Professor Mohamed Faadiel Arnold, the rector for Holistic Leisure Learning University. And in this, we tapped into his historian hat, alhamdulillah. Awesome listening to how the Muslims didn't really actually, are not really descendants of slaves, because we were able to keep our surnames. So that's just one proof. But enjoy the rest of your Heritage Day. Make the most of it. And join us for the next Life Matters show. Wassalamu alaikum and goodbye for now.